And now, please welcome Laimon Eglentals.
He was a secret agent before James Bond. He was at Her Majesty's Secret Service. You see, Britain had a problem. It faced its gravest threat than it ever had before. It could have been destroyed. What happened was Nazi Germany had invaded Denmark. When it came and invaded Denmark, Denmark had other territories. It actually owned or had claim to Iceland. And if the Nazis went and occupied Iceland, they'd be able to put submarine base there, an aircraft base there, and they would be able to stop all the shipping and air movements between America and England. If that had happened, sea blockade on England, starvation for the people, it would have fallen, it would have become Nazi territory. So, England needed to do something. It needed to have its best. They called on someone on a secret mission that has been forgotten until now. They needed someone who was intellectual. They needed a scholar. They needed someone who was a brilliant speaker. They didn't need some guy shaking martinis and chasing women. They needed someone else. They called on the one in England who had the best skills, the best ability, the best mind, the best intellect. They called one who was a scholar at Oxford, who could speak and command an audience, who people gathered and flocked into his meetings when they weren't going to their other lectures because they wanted to hear what he had to speak. Britain, they called upon not James Bond, they didn't need him. They called upon C.S. Lewis on a secret operation that he spoke to the people of Iceland. He was to be the bridge between England and Iceland so that Britain could invade and take Iceland so that they could maintain the bridge between England and America. And C.S. Lewis produced the first broadcast that he ever did was of Norse mythology and English literature to bridge America, to bridge the link between Iceland and the British people so that when the British would arrive there, they wouldn't be seen as the occupiers. The mission was a success, and in an act of occupation where not one soldier was died or killed, nor from Iceland, the British took over and were able to maintain that link. They were able to see the link of a brotherhood between Iceland and England through the speeches and recordings that C.S. Lewis broadcast to the Icelandic people. It wasn't known for decades until an LP came out and was found by a C.S. Lewis historian and was able to hear of this talk that he gave that was unknown for 70 decades. It reminds me of another time between a bridge and a link between two groups. Someone who was also trying to be a brother between two different factions. We go back and we look at the story in the Bible of Jesus' brother, one who also has largely been forgotten by history and forgotten because he was too controversial. It's very common to have a controversy in life, who's your father? But it wasn't that so for James. The controversy has always been, who's your mother? It wasn't a controversy for James at all. He always knew. He knew who he was. He knew who his family was. He knew that he was the brother of Jesus. Imagine being the brother of Jesus. You would grow up in the same household. You would grow up playing games together. You were under the same roof. There was no secrets in a household. James knew Jesus better than you could say anyone else on earth. But when it came time for it, and Jesus started his ministry to go and preach, James, he actually wasn't there supporting his brother. He was actually opposed. He was actually holding him back, saying, what are you doing? If you look at the biblical account, James was not backing Jesus. It was more like there was conflict and tension in the family. And when there's tension in a family, that's the hardest part of all. I can cope and manage if there's stress from outside. But when there's stress in your home, when there's stress between your own family, when there's stress between your own brothers and sisters and husband or wife, that's the hardest one to deal with. And that's what Jesus had, because James at first, he was a brother. But then James, he was a doubter. He doubted Jesus' mission. He doubted what Jesus was called to do. The interesting thing when we look and we go further into the story of James is he didn't stay that way. If you look at the story of James, until the cross, he wasn't seen as a disciple. He wasn't seen as anyone who was supporting Jesus in his ministry. But then the resurrection happened, and straight after that, we see James in a new role. He went from being a doubter to being a believer. It mentions only briefly in the New Testament how that there was a time when James saw the risen Lord. He saw Jesus. He saw who he saw as his brother risen, and he was transformed. He had a time and a moment that completely changed his life and pointed it in a new direction, and it would never be the same again. James was a leader. James was also one who was a mediator between two groups. When you look at James, he was the brother of Jesus. He was also a Christian, one of the first leaders of the early church. But at the same time, James was also a Jew, and he stayed a Jew. He was always seen as a Jew, and he was one who was a lawkeeper. James was trying to be a bridge. He was trying to reconcile Judaism and Christianity. He was trying to go down as someone who can uphold both. But if we look in history, it hasn't really quite turned out that way, much to, I'm sure, James' displeasure. James, one who was always having controversy. There was controversy when he was born. Who was his parents? And that's still a controversy in many churches today. You go through and look at the writings of James, and there's more controversy. There's controversy over faith versus works. There's controversy over what James wrote. Some people wish he probably didn't write anything at all. But he is the brother of Jesus. He's the one who knew him so well. And we look and we see the life of James. In his own life, there was tension in his family. There's tensions in what he's written. But there's also tensions in his death. James as well was a martyr. In much similar circumstances to his brother Jesus, he was also taken and tried by the religious leaders of his day who were opposed to his teaching. For a long time, he was accepted in certain Jewish circles, and it's like, as long as you follow this, you'll be fine, and we don't have a problem with you. But many decades later, in AD 62, it was believed, he was actually executed by the religious leaders of his day. And according to the traditions, is that he was thrown off the walls of Jerusalem, which would be very close to where his brother Jesus was also persecuted by the religious leaders a few decades prior. When we look at this story of James, we can see someone who's been neglected, someone who's been forgotten. He went from being a doubter, a brother, to a believer. He was one who was a Christian. He was one who was a Jew. He was one who was trying to reconcile two different groups. There was a one that stirred religious controversy from the start that keeps on going through this day. James was an author. James was someone who we know a bit about and who can give us much wisdom. But as well with James, even in his death, he continues to cause and stir trouble. A few years ago, there was discovered a ushery box, a funeral box where they put the bones for Jews of the first century. And on that, there was an inscription which read about this box claiming to be from James, the brother of Jesus. It was a great debate within Israel that James is still causing a controversy in Israel to this day, almost 2,000 years later, because was it true? Was it authentic? Was it actually a forgery by a modern-day group who inscribed those words on this ushery box? There was a court case in Israel that lasted 7 years, and at the end it was acquitted because even the judge said he didn't know. He couldn't prove if it was a forgery or not. It may be authentic, it may not be. We look at James, and the one thing we do know about James, and the doubt and the controversy that he stirred up so many areas in his life, but we do know this about James. James, the son of Joseph, the brother
To help
of
you
Jesus.
understand God's Word in a whole new way, go to goodnewsunlimited.com. You can sign up there to get your free devotional delivered to you each day. This program has been paid for by the partners and friends of Good News Unlimited. Word spreads fast.